Morning all, let's have a look at game 6 of the Moscow World Championship match of 1984, which was controversially aborted at one stage by FIDE. Campomanes was president of FIDE at the time. So in game 6, this was an interesting game. Kasparov playing white. He kicked off with d4, and we saw knight f6 from Anatoly, and after c4 we saw e6, wanting to go into the Nimzo-Indian defence. This was sidestepped by Garry Kasparov by playing knight f3, so we're in Queen's Indian territory. The move here played by Anatoly is very solid. b6. After g3 we see bishop a6, immediately attacking the c4 pawn. There are various ways for white to defend this c4 pawn. b3 is chosen by Garry Kasparov. After bishop b4 check, this is a disruptive check, putting that bishop on d2, where white has lost some influence over the d4 square. Doesn't matter about losing a tempo here. With bishop retreating now to e7, it's done its job. And on c3, the bishop, for example, could be a target to later either knight e4s or on the c file. Okay, so the loss of tempo is an accepted part of opening theory. Bishop g2 now, and now Anatoly castles, not fearing any discovered attack on his rook for the moment. He can easily close up this diagonal if needed with c6. So white castles, and now we see d5, putting more pressure on c4 and trying to encourage maybe pressure on e2 later as well if there's an exchange. For a moment c takes d5 is not played. Garry Kasparov plays knight e5, and then we see c6, keeping the knight on b8 for a moment to protect c6, and the usual method is trying to swap off this knight with knight fd7. Now bishop c3 is played, and then we see in this position knight fd7, trying to swap off that advanced knight. White takes, knight takes, knight d2. It looks like a fairly standard theoretical position. Rook c8, and now white plays e4. Anatoly makes use of his pressure on c4 a bit more now with the move b5. So there's a lot of tension building here, which is not resolved by this next move, just rook e1. And now Anatoly takes on c4 with the d pawn, leaving his b pawn there for potential b4 or takes. But for the moment he encourages white to do something with the move knight b6. So with the d pawn there's frontal pressure on d4 as well, and there might be a threat of knight a4 to dislodge the bishop to attack d4 again. White takes on b5, which leaves black with a 2-to-1 pawn majority after this recapture. Is that useful, or are these squares useful? The bishop is also now a subject of attack on that c file. It is protected with rook c1, but now another forcing move from Anatoly, bishop a3. Perhaps relishing forcing moves attacking rooks from game 3, echoes of game 3, pushing Kasparov around a bit here. Rook has to go, it seems, to c2 to keep defence of the bishop on c3. Now we see knight a4 attacking the bishop again. Bishop a1. Now an exchange of rooks. Now after queen a5 it seems black is very well prepared for rook c8 without white being able to challenge that c file. If you look at all of black's pieces, they're eyeing a lot of squares. Even this bishop is potentially useful, but it's an impressive array of pieces on the a file for black. However, rook c8 is looking pretty useful. There's only one entry point here, on c6, but that can't be made use of, it seems here, because the queen takes d2. So white plays queen d1, and now we see rook c8. Black looks a little bit better on the queen side at this present moment of the game, even though it looks like an amazing number of pieces on the A file, and this bishop might be the problem piece, it seems, but you know, it's ready to expand with b4 at a certain point. Maybe the bishop retreats. Okay, so knight b3, queen b4 is played. Still eyeing that c3 square as if knight c3 is going to be useful. Or there's other alternatives, of course, like queen c2 plan. A plan to get the queen to c2 might be on the cards. d5 is played here, at least trying to give white that pass pawn here on the d file. That d pawn is now passed after e takes, e takes. But now the plan is revealed to try and play another forcing move which looks quite powerful, knight c3, to encourage bishop takes c3, but Kasparov refuses here. For bishop c3 he plays instead queen d4. Okay, inviting an exchange of queens. The invitation is accepted. Anatoli takes the queen off, because now, of course, he can win a pawn. But was Garry very optimistic about this d5 pass pawn? This next move looks very dangerous indeed for black. Knight c6. Threatening a7. The bishop's tied down, protecting e7 at the moment. Okay, so what is going on here? And also, there might be an idea of bishop d4 to target a7 to regain the pawn, potentially leaving white with a very dangerous d-pawn in this position. Well, Anatoli seems to be concerned about bishop d4, or he might have been, that might have been the principal concern with his next move, bishop c5. So if bishop d4, well, he would have options there to take. His back row is a bit vulnerable at the moment. So a move like rook c6, there's potentially rook e8, but at the moment, okay, this back row in this position, it would be nice to get some air. So let's see though, bishop h3, the rook doesn't have too many moves here. It goes to a8. Bishop c5, of course, also protected that pawn on a7. So has white got enough pressure for the pawn here, which has been sacrificed? Otherwise, he's faced with also a 2-0 pawn majority here. Can he make use of his d pawn? He plays bishop d4. Anatoli takes on d4. And then we see king f8 guarding the entry point on e7. d6 creating that entry point again, and the pawn's getting more dangerous. Knight c3. Now knight c6. And it looks as though there's a huge threat in this position of d7 and d8. An accurate move is needed here, for sure. And an accurate move seems to have been played now by Anatoli, namely bishop b7. Okay, attacking the knight, prepared, if the knight moves, maybe rook d8 might be possible, but we'll check in detail in the second pass through this game. For the moment the knight's protected. And now another accurate move. It seems rook e8. For the moment that d-pawn is delayed by all this constant threats on white's pieces. Knight e5. Now f6, another threat on white's piece. Not minding losing the bishop for the knight. d7, trying to maintain that pawn for a little while longer. Rook d8. And now more simplification. Bishop takes b7, f takes e5. Is the worst over for black in regards to this pawn? It's protected for a moment. But now king e7, a very powerful move. It seems. Offering, in fact, a potential exchange sack. In the game, bishop takes b5 was played, trying to play for rook e5 and rook b5 to try and hold that position. But we'll look at this in more detail in a bit. But check would seem dangerous because of this idea of maybe rook e8 here. In this position, it might be tempting to play a positional sacrifice with rook takes d7, leaving black with the knight and the two connected passed pawns. But we'll check later if that really is possible, or if it's another reason behind this, that why the more straightforward rook takes e5 is not possible here. So instead Garry played bishop takes b5. We see more exchanges. So rook takes e5, and then the pawn is lost. But after the smoke clears here, Anatoly is one passed pawn up the a pawn. Can he convert this into a win? Okay, so this is a very instructive, very high level rook and pawn ending, as high level as they get. World Championship match of 1984. We're past a pawn here. First the king attacks the rook. That pawn on h7 is defended. Now the rook gets behind the pawn, trying to restrict white's rook into a more passive role here. So king b6, and now the pawn is ready to go forward. So after king f1, a4, after king e2, king c5. The king has two options, either to help assist the pawn or to use the pawn as a decoy to try and get to white's pawns here. To king d2, we see a3 restricting white's rook even further. King c1 is played, and now king d4. So more options for the king just to go to these pawns and sack a pawn. It seems to be the main plan right now. After f4, king e4, king b1, and now after check, if king c2, I think just rook b2, just to simplify and win this king and pawn ending, because this king's going to just march and win material. So king, the awkward looking king a1 is made use of, but now we see rook b2 made use of. So again, white cannot take on b2, but he can take on a3. So we have an exchange of that a pawn for the h pawn, with the rook now on the 7th rank, equal on pawns. Is this easier to win than earlier now? So we have an advantage of king position and rook quality. King b1, the king tries to come over to help the situation. Rook d2, potentially building a bridge with rook d3. On these two pawns are now very vulnerable. Rook a6, potentially not only defending but attacking g7. That's prevented now with king f5. Rook a7. And now Anatoly plays g5, not minding another exchange of pawns here. He can win just with the g pawn he thinks by playing this. So rook a6. And here, okay, the pawn cannot move because a check would be very embarrassing. Winning g5 cleanly. In this position, this is a very interesting conception now from Anatoly. What does he play here? The other alternative to what was played is, well, there's two main alternatives to look at, like maybe rook h2 is worth pardon, is worth a look at. But in the game, a seemingly very clever move is played. If I give you 10 seconds in this position, can you spot what Anatoli plays here, starting from now? Okay, he plays g4. He doesn't mind giving up this pawn. So let's see, rook takes, and he's going to win a pawn match surely now in return, and still have an advantage of the king in this position. Check, king e4. Okay, Garry Kasparov tries f5. And now again in this position it would seem all too easy just to take on g3, but does that throw away the win here? Instead, a different move is played. Can you see what black plays here? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Rook f2. We'll check this out in the second pass, why rook g3 might not be as good as rook f2, or what engine thinks anyway of the position. King comes one step closer, king c1. And now an opportunity for king f3 for the king to win this pawn, leaving the rook behind the pawn here. So king d3 regaining pawns, so equal on pawns, king e1. Now king g2, not minding something like check here, because this g pawn will be queening. Rook g5, g3, rook h5. Okay, and now in this position, rook f4, keeping behind white's pawn, and it looks as though king f3 is on the cards. Or is the idea also to play rook e4 check? Maybe that's the main idea, because the king is controlling these three squares. Just to kick this king back a little bit will be useful as well. And in fact here, after Garry Kasparov plays king e2, the king is kicked back with check. And now we see king f3, so slightly improving the position with the king a little bit further, and again prepared for rook f4 to get behind that pawn again. Rook h1 is tried, g2, after check now, it seems there are two possibilities, king g4 or king f2. Maybe king f2, it might not be adequate in this position, but we'll check in the second pass. In the game, king g4 was played, attacking that rook on h3, rook h8. Okay, preparing to defend against queen with the check. Rook f4, getting behind white's pawn again, with the king here now. Slightly different story now. In fact, for the first time now for a long time, black is going to be a pawn up now. After king e2, rook takes f5, and of course the rook is cut off the king like this. And here actually Garry resigns. A bridge has also been built for the checks for rook g5, so this is difficult to allow the queen here now. Let's have a quick look under engine inspection in this game. In this final position, check, king h3, rook g6. Now here, rook f1, I think we'll be winning. The checks will run out there for a moment, and here Rook f8. And now this will do rook h8, so the king can come to h2 without being checked. And now king h2 will be winning here. There's no stopping the pawn now. If king f2, well, easiest is maybe check and then queening. Obviously there's no perpetuals here or anything. You can give up the queen if needed. Okay, so let's go back in the game and have a look. A queen's engine defense, very solid from Anatoly, and he put immense pressure on that c4 pawn pretty soon. From an engine point of view, this position is about equal. Okay, knight b6. Of consideration is actually c5 here from an engine point of view. If knight a4, queen c2, offering to give up the bishop, it's very interesting. If the bishop's given up, it seems white has something out of the opening here, technically. Very interesting to give up that bishop there. So c5 is probably worthy of consideration. So in the game, we saw c takes b5, which seemed to land back black with more pressure on the queen side, and that c file being very vulnerable. Black's pieces seem very active here. After rook c1, that is asking for a forcing move bishop a3. It's strange that game 3 also features forcing moves against rooks, and this game as well. Anatoly even playing black and being able to play forcing moves with his bishops to attack rooks like this. It seems a bit unusual. Knight a4, okay. So rooks come off, queen a5, but still technically it's almost about equal, but this is a success for black here really to have this position. It looks impressive anyway visually, all the pieces on the a file, but the c file position at the moment looks as though it should mean quite a bit. But this queen d1 retreat is to support potential past d pawn here. Queen b4, we see d5, so that d pawn getting quite dangerous potentially. Easy, we see knight c3. Missed opportunity here. From an engine point of view, there are other moves apart from queen d4 which might be better. In fact, queen h5 is coming up here. Very interestingly, it's a powerful move. Is this really the case? Let's go with it. What is the idea? Queen h5. So if the knight takes, attacking knight on b3, queen e5, threatening the back row. Or not? Is that the idea? Also, no, that's not the idea. f8 is under control. The idea is to threaten mate. Pardon me. And there's a loose rook here, potentially on c8, or is there another loose piece to consider, or is it the back row now? If f6, I think the back row collapses. Let's have a look at f6. So check. In this position now, bishop f6 or rook e3. Let's have a quick look at bishop f6, which seems more direct. That is dangerous for the king's safety. If that is taken, rook e5 for rook g5, that's slaughter of the king. So these pieces on the a file might not have been that helpful for defending the king here. On bishop takes f6, I mean that looks pretty bad if black is forced to play like this. And knight d4, bishop takes, rook e8, it's crashing through. The check, using that pin very cleverly. Okay, bishop f1. is blunder, of course, because of losing the rook. So rook takes e1, knight takes b5, and white would be better here, it seems. That pawn is very useful here, so that's a very interesting move. If we have a look again, so in this position, after knight c3, was this a critical mistake from white not to go in with queen h5? Well, knight takes e2 is a bit greedy. If we go with another move, like, okay, let's go with queen f8, which looks a bit passive though. Bishop h3, rook e3. What's the threat here? Well, on the knight, clearly there's a threat. So if that takes there now, bishop takes g7 again. The weakened back row comes into play here. Material down for white, but d6 looking quite powerful. And that bishop is being made use of to the full extent for supporting d7. So the dream of the d pawn is being fully realised in these variations, it seems, after the prelude. Queen h5. White would again seem to be better if black's forced to give up the rook here. It's pretty bad. Okay, so really, is there no way of defending against queen h5? If we look at just g6, then is that asking for it? Queen e5. And what would be the point here immediately? Well, that knight's holding up the diagonal eyes, but it's being mated, so this isn't probably the best reaction in the world, just to demonstrate what could happen. Now bishop h3 and this d pawn being dragged again, and the rook must not leave c3 protection here. So the rook's overloaded on c3. Just to make sure we see that bishop takes c3. Sorry. So f5 being prompted. Now check. Well, this is all over. The king's being mugged again here. Bishop takes f5. In this position, rook e3 looks powerful. I think the idea is just rook takes c3 and queen f6, but let's just check that. Say black plays this, a5. Let's go with a check. Bishop takes. The check here. Well, there's a vulnerability on c3 being used as well as winning the queen. So queen h5 is this really a powerful move in this position, which was missed by white. So that could have been treated as a mass decoy to get all the black's pieces on the a file. So queen h5. What other defences could there be? Let's say black plays queen d6. Just taking as a back row weakness. There's not too many options for white. Let's give up the queen there with queen f8. So queen h5. Interesting. Queen c4 is mentioned. Okay, queen c4. And again, we've got this idea. I guess the idea is to hold up the pawn, so the bishop is now free for bishop h3. I think that's the principal intuitive idea now. And I see, because here, bishop h3 is a very powerful move, it seems. And the queen is still holding on to d5 and creating threats along this diagonal and on the e file as well, potentially. So here, for example, queen takes d5. White can just win material. Wow. So it seems in the game this is a feeble, dare say, from the engine point of view. From the engine point of view, it wasn't the best to play queen d4. But it looks as though still it's a small advantage for white. technically. Tiny advantage. Even after giving up a2, this powerful looking knight c6. Did Anatoly get a bit lucky here? Now, is the a pawn really under fire? Okay, so bishop c5 protects the a pawn immediately. If it wasn't protected, well, let's say bishop f8. Is the a pawn actually the point here, or something else? Or is it again this bishop h3 idea indeed? Taking the a pawn is probably harmless. It's not the idea at all, perhaps. Black's active here, maybe. And it's going to play something like, well, let's follow a line. Bishop f1, f6, knight takes, bishop takes, bishop takes, bishop c5. Okay, it's still okay for white, but black seems to have some coordination on f2. Okay, so that's actually going up for white there anyway. So in the game, we see bishop c5, and now we see bishop h3 being made use of here, which looks very useful for supporting d6 and d7. A stronger move perhaps available here. Bishop b2 or knight e7. What would bishop b2 actually do? I suppose technically it threatens rook a1. These pieces are loose for a moment. If bishop b7, then check. Rook takes it, hitting b7. Bishop e5, winning material. King f8, only move perhaps. Takes. d6, yes, finally winning material on that bishop. That bishop is definitely a liability. Okay. So there seems to be this technical move here, which is interesting. But in the game, okay, so bishop h3 seems logical as well, just to drag the d pawn down. And now we see bishop d4. Black seems to be equalising after bishop d4, so that might not be the most critical in this position. Okay, so bishop d4, and black seems to technically be doing okay. So king f8, we see knight c3, knight c6 does seem dangerous, but bishop b7, perhaps that's the only move to keep black in the game here. He has to challenge white, because otherwise d7 and knight is forcing through d8. So that knight's got to be challenged, and it's enough, it seems. Now rook e8, another powerful move, making use of the king on f8. No time for d7 again. Knight e5, and now another powerful move again from Anatoly, f6. Forcing moves and powerful moves at the same time positionally. Maybe that's the best sort, as we've seen from game 3. A lot of forcing moves which have positional goals to them. So what does white do here? He hasn't got too many choices. If he plays d7, let's quickly look at that. Rook d8. Does it improve much from the game? Possibly not much. Black has e4 here as well as king e7. No rook c1, knight e2. So, okay, it seems the worst is over for Anatoly here, and white is forced into this ending he didn't really expect to have, perhaps. After king e7, let's quickly check out some things here. So, rook takes e5, king d6, rook e8. Was the idea rook d7? No. Sorry. That was a fantasy idea, the exchange sack. Better in this position, no need for the exchange sack. These are not going anywhere, with just king c7 apparently. King c7, promote that variation for your PGN. in the description of the video. So king c7 here. It seems, yes, this looks like a huge passed pawn on the way, and white is fully blockaded with his d pawn, so that's pretty helpless. The other pawn can come to support. Probably premature to play b6 here. There's a check anyway, winning the knight. Pretty very premature. So a5, holding that knight on c3 for a moment against rook c6, and this is now bad news. If rook a6, a4, the pawns are getting too dangerous. Okay, it's clear the pawns are winning. So let's go back. So yes, it seems this king e7 is a lovely way of getting that blockade on d8 reinforced with king coming to c7 here. So instead, the better move, the lesser evil for white, is to take on b5 to at least break up the 2-0 pawn majority and make it just a one pawn over there. But now black shows how much pressure can be put on white here. Drives the rook back. Black's better, but carving out the win. Okay, again, black is visually better. So white is passive here after rook b2, rook h2. Okay, let's see the advantage where it massively might have gone up. Okay, so g5 here was played after rook a6. Was there any other alternatives for black? g4 was played in the game, which maybe surprises the engine a little bit to play g4. Rook g2 or g takes might also be interesting. If rook h2, that potentially is also interesting as well. So this was a little bit of a surprise, perhaps, this g4 from an engine point of view anyway. G4 offering the h6 pawn, but the quality overrules the material, it seems. So rook g2, and it's back for black being more than half a pawn advantage off this. Okay, and the engine's gone to sleep here. So we saw conversion here. Let's try and stop and start that. Whoops. Okay, this might take a few seconds. Yes, it was a very long and complex game, leading to this rook and pawn ending, which is also quite tense, and perhaps instructive for any of us to see how we can win such a position with the outside passed pawn. Before that, it seems, yes, queen d4. Let's turn on the engine again now. And let's go back there. So in this position, black was doing well, it seems. Brings his king in. Now something happened here after king d1. Now the engine really likes black's position after king g3. And it's seeing far enough now that black is doing well. Rook f4, that seems actually almost the key move here. King f3 and rook f4, rook f4. Driving the king back. Now king f3, best move currently. g2, and now it seems, okay, now if king f2, then okay, this is not such a strong move, but it still seems this must be winning for black, surely. It's winning for black as well, but this is even more powerful the way Anatoli played it with king g4. So rook h8, rook f4, finally a pawn up, very dangerous pawn. So the king goes to escape, checks soon on that g1 square for a moment, stage 1, and then stage 2 is, yes, he was about to threaten check, and if the king goes to f3 then that shields the king from checks, so king f1 there after king f3. If rook d7, that introduces more checking possibilities, so that doesn't work, I guess. If check here, king f3, was this still winning for black? It still looks as though this is winning for black, but more precise is I guess what Anatoli plays, rook h8 immediately, yeah. So then rook g7, king h2, and now the queen is going to arrive. Okay, it was around move 70 that actually Kasparov had resigned this game, so we've overshot here. The position which Kasparov resigned was on 70, rook takes f5. So rook takes f5. This was all kind of assumed that's the loss for white here. Standard rook and pawn ending technique. Okay, so yeah, it was an impressive Queen's Indian game with some, maybe this opportunity, very interesting opportunity. Queen h5 was missed. Sort of Queen d4 going into the end game, which Karpov did well to manage to get the advantage from it, perhaps unexpectedly. So from a technical point of view, white was still okay after Queen d4, it seems. Let's go back to this critical position. Technically, white is actually okay, but Karpov simply seemed to outplay or provoke forward this d pawn to be blockaded, for black's pawns to be more important. Amazing. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.